Okay, I think we're live. Welcome everyone to another edition of the Perception Action Journal Club. Today, it's my real pleasure to be joined by three members of the Rio group, which is a research in imagery and observation, Adam, Dan, and Dave. And what we're going to do is talk a little bit about using these tools, observation, demonstration, imagery, in practice, as in for sports coaching, and connecting it to the research. It's a very well-studied research area. So I thought we'd talk about some kind of practical tips as well as what's going on research-wise. And then at the end, we can talk about some of the stuff going on with Rio, which has a seminar series they just started, which has a lot of really interesting speakers. So as usual, if you're following along on Facebook or YouTube, if you want to post something, a question for anyone in the comments section, I can pull it in and we can ask it to these and do our best to answer it. So I thought I would start off by letting everyone introduce themselves and tell them a little bit about ourselves. So Adam, I'll let you kick it off.
Thanks, Rob. Hi, I'm Adam Bruton. I'm a senior lecturer in psychology of human performance at Roehampton in London. My research focuses on obviously using imagery and observation as techniques in sport, predominantly looking at kind of trying to enhance confidence in athletes as well as enhance their performance or facilitate their learning of sport-based skills predominantly.
Okay. And Dan?
Yeah, hi. So I'm a senior lecturer in sport and exercise science at Teesside University, which is in the northeast of England. And research-wise, again, like Adam and a lot of overlap with Dave, we study imagery and observation, the way that those two processes in the brain relate to each other. So from a cognitive neuroscience point of view, and then also interested in how that can drive brain plasticity for rehabilitation as a possible mental in impaired populations with motor impairment. So I could go into that a little bit later.
Okay. Yeah, great. We usually do have a physical therapists and other people in the rehab following along too. So that would be great. And Dave.
Thanks, Rob. Hi, everyone. My name's David Wright. I'm a senior lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University in the northwest of England. My research interests are very similar to Dan and Adam's. We've worked quite closely together on quite a few papers in the past. Primarily, my research is interested in the sort of neurophysiological and behavioural effects of action observation and motor imagery interventions. And I'm particularly interested in the combined approach. So if we're using motor imagery during action observation, done quite a bit of research using transcranial magnetic stimulation to explore what's going on in the brain and the motor system when people do combined observation and imagery interventions. I'm also interested in looking at how this technique can be applied to different populations, whether it be sport or children with developmental coordination disorder, to improve movement.
Okay, great. Yeah. Well, it sounds like you have a lot of connections and things. That's good. And one of the things I want to get to is this connection. I think you all mentioned this connection between the two, how the two methods kind of enhance each other. But so one of the reasons I thought this would be good to talk about now is that, I have a lot of people, coaches now, where they're having really limited time on the actual field with athletes. So they're looking for things they can do off the court. Or if they have them, they have to really get bang for the buck. And so, they're asking about how can we use video to demonstrate things, and how can we kind of do observation techniques. So I thought I would start off with maybe the most common question I get is, who should you be the model for the demonstration? I know that's kind of been studied over a long time. I don't know if any of you have done, but maybe starting with you, Adam, what's kind of the view on, should I be using someone way above me in skill level, more of a peer? What is kind of the thinking about that right now?
Yeah, I think and we actually had a chat about this on Friday with Diane St. Marie, kind of based on her talk. And the who question as part of using observation imagery or actually both varies depending usually on the function. So if you're looking at like learning a new skill, for example, you'd ideally want to have an initial understanding of how to do it well, and then maybe maybe using some an expert peer model or something like that, and then possibly along the stages of learning, introducing different variants of that to try and facilitate, I guess, understanding of how that expert sequence pieces together, maybe.
Okay. Dan or Dave, do you have any?
Are you specifically thinking about a particular performance level in, are you talking like a motor learning acquisition from?
Yeah, so I guess you have a fairly novice athlete that you're kind of, teaching them tennis or something. If you're trying to use, observational learning or demonstration, do you want to show them, like this is Federer, how he does the forehand, or closer to a more peer, or is there Adam, you seem like a transition between the two might be beneficial as well.
I've got an answer. Dave, do you want to go first, or shall I?
Can do, yeah, if you don't mind, yeah. Yeah, I was thinking it kind of varies, and there probably isn't a one answer that addresses the question. An expert model can be useful for many reasons, but then equally, if you're talking about a novice like you just described, Rob, you've got the issue of, well, this is so high above the level that I can achieve that I'm not going to be able to perform that, and it can actually be quite demotivating potentially for the individual. A lot of the stuff we do with observation and imagery is trying to match or try and recreate as closely as possible the real world experience. So in that regard, making the model as similar as possible to the individual, whether it's a self model potentially or a proficient peer model, if that's an option as well, it could possibly be the best solution, and then maybe using an expert model in conjunction with that.
Okay. Dan, did you want to?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Adam and Dave have said. I think from an observational, like you said, there's a lot of research that has tried to carefully manipulate the display and what's shown in the display. But I think kind of exciting, how do those different displays make the participant look and think about the task differently? And it kind of maybe an untapped question is this, like, well, if we show it in this particular way, how does the learner watch? And I don't think we've got to a point where we're systematically testing the different ways in which the learner approaches the problem as a result of the way the display is shown. So I'm kind of...
I think we're losing you a bit here, Dan. Sorry, I lost that last part. Can you?
I don't know how much you got. I was just saying that,
Sorry? Oh, okay.
I don't know.
I think I got up to that. So you were saying about we don't know quite what people are looking for or how they're taking in the information from different models. Yeah. Is there work on kind of gaze tracking? And I'm gonna ask you a whole bunch of questions today. I warn that I didn't prepare you guys at all, so maybe this is not anything you've researched or anything. But is there work on gaze tracking on observational learning? What an athlete, what they look at when they're observing a model? Adam, have you seen any kind of thing on that?
Yeah,
maybe that would kind of get at Dan's question a little bit.
Yeah, I know Dave's done some of this. Kind of integrated with his neurophysiological studies, so I'll let him comment on a few of them and how that kind of changed the motor activity as a result of directed attention. But we've done I guess what you find with observational learning is a lot of the research is quite diverse and quite pitched at whatever the intended outcome is. So you find that kind of even study to study, there's quite a lot of variation in how the actual observation is presented. Often the imagery instructions, if they are aligned with it, vary. And also the attentional cueing is also something that is inconsistent. Sometimes people direct attention, sometimes they don't. So I guess, yes, we do have, there's eye tracking literature that's looked at observational learning for quite complex kind of golf swing type skill, and shown that directing attention more to kind of the central aspect of the body it allows better information pickup, and I guess that's based on the transition maybe of the hips. Whereas you've got other skills where seemingly if you direct the attention more towards either the goal of the outcome or an area where the movement kind of like a pivot type kind of position, that seems to be more effective. So yes, we do have an understanding of that. We've done a few studies trying to look at if we're using observation to kind of enhance efficacy beliefs, what do people look at when they're trying to kind of gauge how confident they are when viewing themselves, and it seems to be that a lot of the time they're kind of social comparative in the way they view things. So they're often making kind of key comparisons between themselves and the opposition to try and gauge how well they're doing something, but that's in team sports settings, so that makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I don't really have a set answer for that question, but
I think
a lot of variation in all honesty in the literature for that.
Yeah. So Dave, you've done some of that kind of.
It wasn't necessarily an observational learning study. It was an action observation study. Just as we brought some participants into the lab and we were showing them some simple hand movement videos. The actual movement task was just a hand squeezing kind of stress ball. So it was a very, quite a far removed from sports kind of movement. And we were using transcranial magnetic stimulation and eye tracking. The transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, if people aren't familiar with it, how it works is that we place a stimulating coil on the motor cortex representation, and then we can deliver a stimulation to activate that area of the brain. So if we put it over the motor cortex region that controls hand muscles and stimulate the person's head, it will send a signal down from the brain to the hand muscles and cause the hand muscles to contract. And then we use EMG electrodes on the hand to record the amplitude of that response to give us an indication of how active the corticospinal system is at the time that we delivered the stimulation. And what we did in this study was stimulate people's motor cortex whilst they were observing the ball being pinched. And then we recorded the EMG activity from the muscles that would be involved in pinching the ball. And we had a couple of different conditions. One of them was a kind of free viewing condition. So we allowed participants to look wherever they wanted to, wherever sort of felt natural to them. We had another condition where we directed their attention through instructions to focus on the thumb or the finger. I can't remember exactly which one, but we focused them to look at the body part that was involved. And then in the third condition, we asked them to focus on the ball, and we found so on the external object that they were holding, and we found increased amplitude motor evoked potentials, or MEPs, in the condition when participants were focusing on the ball. So that ties in a little bit with what Adam was saying before, where we were making recommendations based on that you should try and direct attention away from the body, more towards the object that you were interacting with. We found a sort of stronger neurophysiological response, and we used the eye tracking in that to just kind of almost as a control measure, just to check that they were fixating on the thing that we asked them to fixate on. And when they did, like I say, there was a bigger amplitude response when it was directed away from the body. It's a little bit of a stretch probably to say, based on this, you should focus on whole body sport tasks, but that was what we found.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Kind of the link to the focus of attention kind of findings. That's really interesting. You're right, and it's probably very opposite to what we usually do. We'll look very internally focused and things. You mentioned self-modeling. So I get a lot of people asking about using that. So in self-modeling, do you want to? This maybe gets into kind of the feedback, yoked feedback kind of thing. Do you want to show just people being successful, or is there any self-modeling showing, I don't know, errors? And is there any, do you know of any work on that kind of thing? Whether you always, kind of like the feedback choice, do you want to just show you doing it well and ignore the trials when you do it wrong? I don't know if there's been any research done on that. Any thoughts on?
Yeah, I guess it fits in with the knowledge of performance kind of literature based,
Yeah.
doesn't it? And I guess video is quite a popular way of providing knowledge of performance. I think from what I've read anyway, that the self-modeling literature typically has been this positive self-review. So predominantly, let's show you being kind of successful and hope that you can then kind of repeat that type of movement and subsequent outcome. But I think there have been some studies on more like coping models. So, or I guess self-modeling is as a term is maybe more representative of you, an accurate representation of you. And that will include, obviously, no one's perfect in sport, even the best. So it will include errors along the way. Typically, there's still this kind of bias in the literature towards positive self-review being more beneficial. Seemingly, it doesn't see a lot. There's been a few studies, I think, by kind of Penny McCulloch and the groups that kind of relate to Diane's work, and I think they've typically shown that some null findings for self-modeling based studies when it's been this kind of mixed model. But I guess, yeah, the self-selection literature that she talked a lot about last week actually comes to mind of could you use it along the way if used alongside others. And I think it comes back to we've got a lot of variation here, and maybe that's the best way to use it, the same way we learn from practice.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I know you all mentioned, you do combined. So I thought maybe, Dan, can you tell us a little bit about how, so, in the literature, I always see AO plus MI, right? Action, right? Kind of, how do you combine? Do you have people doing imagery at the same time they're observing someone else, or are they doing it more sequentially? Can you tell us a little bit about how you combine them? Hey, Dan, if you can.
So if we're typically doing a study, one of the first steps would be to screen for imagery ability using a self-report questionnaire, just to establish that the participants are aware of what we mean by imagery, because there's been, kind of discussions at Rio regularly that if you don't, first of all, educate your participant into the terms you're talking about when you're introducing imagery, not everybody has a shared understanding of that. So you would need to standardize that, like a small mini education in what imagery involves. So that, like, we would call it kind of a mental representation or a simulation of a movement that you're going to perform, and engage like your awareness of the effort and the feeling of producing that movement, and also how it would look. And you could introduce how it looks from your own eyes, as well as how it might look if you were watching yourself whilst you were stood somewhere else looking at yourself. So you would want to first of all screen them, and if they've got a basic imagery ability that they're able to say, I can see the images with clarity, and so on, you can then start to kind of introduce the idea, well, we'll use an imagery script for the task that we're going to talk about. So you would build it up in complexity and vividness as best you can, just describing, often using the PETLET model. Paul Holmes and Dave Collins and Dave's worked on that work as well. But, to kind of structure and get it as good as you possibly can. But then when you show them a visual display, the instruction, the next step would be to say, well, what we want you to do now, instead of just doing your imagery with freedom almost in your mind's eye, however you want to do it, we want to give you a visual guide. Okay. So we'd like you to watch the video display and then try and at the same time imagine the feeling and effort that you would experience if you were doing the movement that you watch, and try and do your imagery and your observation synchronized in time. Okay. And we've shown that there can be a lot of differences in terms of the behavioral outcome as well as what goes on in the brain if you add that simple instruction. And that's exciting from a coach point of view, I think, because it costs nothing. It's a little bit of education that the athlete needs to first of all undertake, but then the our excitement in this research area is that there just seems to be such a different process that goes on in the brain, and often significant behavioral benefits as well in performance.
Yeah,
So
no, that's
example,
a really good. Yeah. That's a really great point, Dan. I can imagine like using imagery as a coach. It's kind of scary, uncontrolled. Right? You don't know. There's no way you can know what they're thinking. Imagery you want them to, but so having a way to kind of constrain and bring it in with showing them that's a really good point. Yeah.
And this comes to the thing about when you've got a display, maybe it's not so much the angle you show it and the skill level of the performer. It's more about how you instruct the person to watch it. Because we've, like, say, looking at talking about eye tracking, we've just done some pilot research where when you instruct imagery and observation, when somebody's watching a basketball free throw, they look at the shape of the body more. They're doing the imagery during the observation. Their eye tracking moves more to the body parts, like the joint angles of the free throw. Whereas if you just say predict the outcome of the free throw, it's much more focused on the endpoint, maybe not picking up all that relative motion information. So it could, same display, different instructions, different benefits.
Yeah, no, that's really nice. And so what do you know, Adam or Dave, you've done this as well. Is it kind of like additive effects of when you, or when you do these kind of studies, or what kind of, you measured, you mentioned, Dan, like, performances. What other kind of things have you looked at in terms of the combined effects? Maybe Dave, can you tell us a little bit about what you've done in that?
With the combined observation and imagery?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've done some similar studies to the TMS one that I described earlier. So I won't go through the method again, but stimulating the motor system when people are observing a movement on screen. We've done it with simple hand movements and also more complex things like a basketball free throw. Observing the movements, imagining the movements, and then doing the two things together. And as Dan said, the crucial thing when you're doing them together is you're showing them the video on screen, and they're being asked to imagine the feeling and sensation that they would experience if they were doing the action at the same time. So it's a kinesthetic imagery focus alongside the observation. And then I think we've done 3 or 4 studies in that area now, and we've shown consistently with TMS that we get increased motor evoked potential amplitudes when we combine the observation and the imagery, compared to if you do just observation, particularly, and occasionally just if you compare it to imagery on its own. We've seen some other beneficial effects for it in dart throwing tasks. It was some work done by Steph Romano-Smith, who's at Staff's University now. She'd done for her PhD, she'd shown increased performance effects for a combined observation imagery intervention versus observation alone. So we've tested it in a few things like that with sort of neurophysiological effects and behavioral effects, and seen positive outcomes for it. And I think one of the benefits for it is, if you think about imagery on its own, it's quite difficult if you're imagining, say, a tennis serve or a basketball free throw, to imagine all aspects of the movement. Sometimes people will lose control of the image. The image will fade, or they won't be able to maintain it throughout the whole action. Whereas if we give them the video guide, they don't have to generate that visual image and maintain it throughout the whole sequence. They can just focus on imagining the feeling of doing the movement in time with the observed stimuli, which is kind of beneficial. It makes it an easier process, I would say. From study that Adam and I did, we found participants reporting that it was easier to engage in than just imagery alone, for example.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And you mentioned, Dan, and I'm sure you've also, do you still find there's a big variation in people's ability with mental imagery? Is it Adam, what do you kind of see with that?
Yeah, I mean, we've had some recent discussions in the RIA group about this. Well, I won't say recent, we've discussed the same thing for 5 or so years, kind of hammering home the fact that seemingly imagery ability assessments not kind of unanimously agreed upon, and it seems to be potentially based on some recent stuff where we've kind of gone larger group and shared a lot of imagery ability data amongst ourselves to kind of see what the general patterns are in participants. Actually, it might be slightly inflated, I think, in how people perceive their own imagery ability compared to maybe what is obviously it's very hard to measure directly, but well, not impossible to measure directly, but maybe what is actually happening. Yeah, I think Imagery Ability has a massive role in this. I think the combined approach does maybe negate the influence of imagery because of the fact that you've got the visual aspects kind of provided, and therefore focusing on one aspect of imagery may make it kind of more facilitated by the information you're also getting visually. But yeah, I think based on the studies that we've conducted, it seems that everyone's at least a moderately good imager, and I think people who study things like aphantasia will disagree with that suggestion at the population level. So yeah, I think there might be this kind of ceiling type effect going on.
Yeah, I know along with kind of doing questionnaires and asking people, do you also do? I know people do measures of the timing. How long does the image time it takes you to image a movement kind of match the actual duration when you perform the movement? Do you do those kind of measures to kind of assess ability as well?
I haven't done any of that, but I'm just aware there's a whole battery of tests that you can do for different elements of imagery.
Okay.
So the temporal element of it, how accurate people are at that, how good they are at generating the image itself, how good they are at maintaining the image. They're all potentially different components that might vary depending on the individual as well. So I think those kind of research questions are just being put out there at the minute, that it's not been, again, systematically explored. But just in terms of individual differences, I wanted to mention a PhD student of mine, Jonathan Emerson, has just come to the end of his work, and what he's shown is that imagery ability is significantly reduced if somebody has depression. And in sports, there's literature showing that that's more common than we've ever kind of been aware of in the past. But depression might be something that affects the way that you can internally focus and generate these things. So again, it's exciting research areas, because not all of the answers are there to these questions yet.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, Dan. It's a well-studied thing, but still with tons of interesting questions. I wanted to pick up, I think you mentioned relative motion when you're talking your description, Dan, what people are picking up when they're doing the observation, either combined with imagery or alone. And in particular, I wanted to, because, this idea that I think the traditional way we think about observation is we're showing you the one way to do here's how you do it. This one correct technique. And now, as most people know, if you follow me at all, there's a movement away from that idea. There's only one way to do things, and that you need to be adaptable and individual. Is it possible people can pick, like relative motion, they're picking up information that's not just one prescriptive technique? They're actually picking up things that they could use to kind of be more individual, more adaptable. What are your thoughts on that? I know that's a weird question, but it's kind of where my mind went. Anyone? Yeah. Or maybe Dan, what about the relative motion? What did you did mention that, I think, what did you mean by that? Yeah.
No, the whole thing about kind of practice variability, kind of, to my mind, why does that not make sense in the context of the way in which you show the visual demonstration? Why can there not be variable observational practice? And the more varied it is, why doesn't that then promote more adaptable action representations of the target movement? But then it gets to the question of, what are you using your demonstration for? Is it the yoga move and it has to specifically look like this? That is the way to do it. Or is it a target aiming task where a variety of ways of achieving the outcome? I think that constant versus variable kind of debate that I know you're well aware of, Rob, and how that relates to kind of dynamical system styles of training, and kind of promoting adaptation. I think surely that should just extend into the observational practice field, but I don't think it's been done.
Yeah, I don't know of any. I want to say I read. I can't remember. You say the done kind of you seem like the variability of practice manipulations, like blocked versus random or something, would be an obvious thing to port over into imagery. Do you guys, Dave and Adam, have any thoughts of that? Like using these methods to promote kind of more individual, adaptable movement. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Dave.
Yeah, so I'm quite interested in kind of trajectory modeling, from a demonstration point of view. I don't know I think Dan might have been involved in some of this research from sort of the early to mid 2000s, where instead of showing them the demonstration and saying, look at this technique and copy it, you either show them the whole movement and say, but we want you to focus on the trajectory that they chip the football at or that they throw the basketball at. Or you just show them the trajectory on its own and you don't show them the movement pattern. And it's a case of, well, here's the desired trajectory that you want to achieve. If you chip the golf ball like this, it's going to end up being a good shot. Or if you get a nice high arc on your basketball free throw, then it's got a better chance of falling into the hoop. Mm-hmm. So you just show them that, or you show them the whole thing and direct them to that. And then it's like, figure it out for yourself now. That's your outcome that you've got to achieve. Mm-hmm. See what you can do to get it, and then allow them to explore various different ways to produce that. Maybe Dan was involved in some of that research. I think. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Dan. Or
Kind of
from the past, maybe.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, with Nick Smeaton many years ago, and Nicky Hodges. But what it was just making me think about the exciting kind of framework that imagery combined with observation provides is an opportunity for a single display to be shown, but then you can vary the imagery instructions. So it doesn't have to be that they imagine exactly what they see, because you can actually ask them to imagine something like what they see, but a variation on it. And you can manipulate certain things. So you might manipulate the amplitude, for example, or the speed, or whatever the movement is. So you can get into this kind of adaptability of imagery training off the back of one target video. Or you can do it in reverse, where you could have imagery constant, and then you vary the visual displays. And that was kind of backed up by a TMS study that Dave, Adam, and I worked on, with Adam leading. So, I mean, I don't know if that kind of, you want to get into that area, maybe, Adam, or?
Yeah, I could do. I think, so the study Dan's referring to was one we published in Cortex, what seems like 5 years ago, but it was only last year. Essentially, we use different imagery instructions during the same observation. So simple hand movements, just the kind of, I guess, proof of concept. So it takes it out of that sport arena again. But we got people to observe an index finger movement, and then either imagine the same index finger movement, or imagine the little finger movement at the same time, or imagine keeping the hand still. And we showed different kind of profiles of motor activity for those different tasks in the muscle involved in the index finger movement and the muscle involved in the imagined little finger movement in that condition. And we also used eye tracking to see, would people direct their attention to different kind of aspects of just that scene when they're instructed to do those different tasks, and they did. So the kind of simultaneous observation and imagery of the index finger, they obviously kind of kept their foveal gaze towards that area. But when it became kind of keeping the hand still, they went to a kind of a central point of the hand to try and avoid any movement whatsoever. And in the little finger imagery, they actually kind of went in a like kind of more of your pivot position, where you can try and facilitate both of those things at the same time. So whilst it's not kind of taking that and going, okay, well, learn a tennis serve, and then I wanted you to learn different variants of that, I think the principle that's there is something that we think could be quite useful going forward and testing it in a multitude of ways to see how that could maybe translate into this varied kind of practice, I guess. So it does align.
Yeah, I really like that idea. So I like the kind of imagery can add variability to observation almost. Is that, I think you've all done a little bit of work on the kind of the mechanisms and stuff. And, I know like the traditional view of observation is, linked with kind of mirror neuron idea, right? That when you watch something, you're activating the neurons that you produce that same movement, which makes it sound much more enslaved to what you're seeing than I think what you're describing, how you can manipulate with imagery. You can ask people to do something very different than what they're actually seeing, which I think is a really interesting take on it. Is there still kind of that? Is it the mechanisms kind of evolving and understanding what's going on in this kind of combined the neural mechanisms? Do you talk any about that, Dave? Do you?
Yeah. So like I said before, we've done quite a few studies now where I think it's kind of fairly well established to say there is increased activity in the brain if you combine observation imagery and do them at the same time. So the study Adam just mentioned and a couple of the TMS ones I mentioned before have shown that, and then Dan's also been involved in some research that's shown that with EEG. So I think we're at the point where we kind of can say with quite a degree of confidence that we don't need to keep comparing observation against an imagery against a combined condition, because we've seen that it increases activity in the brain. But now it's a case of, well, what's going on mechanistically when you manipulate the instructions, you vary the imagery content within the observation, or you vary the perspective from which you show the video or the model who takes part in the video. For me, those are the kind of next steps that need to be addressed. There's a little bit of inconsistency in the literature in terms of perspective and models used, either self or other, and first and third person. They've all shown fairly consistent effects, but no one's yet really done a direct comparison to sort of tease out what might be the optimal solutions for different tasks and for different skill levels. So for me, that's where one of the next steps in this kind of field. I don't know if the others agree with that.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think, if it is the case that it's possible for a participant or a performer to represent the action that they're imagining, and that they also represent the action they're observing, and the two representations are different. The question then comes, how do you coordinate the two? From a kind of a hierarchical cognitive kind of approach, and that's what led us to depression. We're looking at people with depression as possibly having a limitation in their ability to switch their attention from something that's outside the visual display to then something that's internal and self-generated. And then when we link that to kind of populations in neuro rehab, the key questions are, to what extent is that instruction practice population, like stroke, children with dyspraxia, kind of Parkinson's disease, to what extent they can manage the kind of the two streams is again exciting questions. I've got more questions than answers. I'm sorry, Rob.
No, that's a sign of a good me too. Almost everything I do, I think that's a good sign. I think that's a really exciting use too. You mentioned it. You Dave, you're doing a little work on the rehab side of things and on using as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that, or at least the different populations?
Yeah, sure. So we're doing some research with children with developmental coordination disorder, or DCD, which is often referred to as dyspraxia, maybe more commonly understood term. But it's some work that we're doing with a guy called Matthew Scott, who was actually one of Dan's old PhD students. So I don't want to sort of take it all away. Dan was involved and obviously is familiar with this area as well. And what we're doing at the moment is trying to see if we can use these combined observation imagery techniques to help children with DCD acquire activities of daily living more easily. So they struggle a lot with things like getting dressed, tying shoes, buttoning shirts, using cutlery, these kind of tasks. So we're trying to see, well, can we use action observation and motor imagery to help these children learn these tasks better. And what we're currently trying to do is look at a home-based intervention with parents, where parents will deliver this intervention via a tablet device with the child over a period of several weeks to see if it results in improvements in motor function. However, the pandemic is causing quite a lot of problems. We've had to pause the start of the project three or four times now, so we're hoping to get it underway with data collection maybe this month or April if we're lucky, but we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, no, that sounds really interesting. I know that's a big area of research. DCD is, a big issue, and that sounds really, really interesting. Adam, I wanted to ask you, going back to kind of the sports angle, one of the issues is, a lot of the imagery tends to be individual, where, if you're a team setting, you might be doing these kind of methods, observation, demonstration to a group. I think I remember reading have you looked at kind of group effects of observation, and can you tell us a little bit about that and how it might extend to working with a team?
My PhD was actually looking at kind of observation in team sport settings, so it was I guess far away from some of the more neurophysiological stuff, but I worked alongside Steve Mellou, who was my supervisor, with kind of age grade rugby over there, so elite age grade rugby. So we did several studies looking at trying to use a lot of their kind of video performance analysis footage and tailor things to try and develop confidence in the individual athletes, but also the team as a whole, through kind of providing quite typically positive self-review at the team level. So this kind of highlight reel type approach to try and make them more confident across seasons, prior to matches, during training. We kind of toyed with various different studies looking at it in different contexts in team sports, and it seems kind of fairly unanimous that this was something that could be quite useful even in the short term and in the longer term, to enhance confidence in teams, but also to hopefully have a knock-on effect for some of the key kind of performance indicators in teams. Now, performance in teams is a tricky thing to measure, and kind of put any fingers on any buttons to say this is what worked. But it was quite well received, and we've done about 6 or 7 studies kind of in team sport settings using observation. And I've got a PhD student just starting who's going to be looking at combined observation and imagery in a team sport setting. So we're trying to work out what that's going to look like. And that's something that, going forward, I'm excited to see how we kind of adapt, I guess, some of the more typical sport-based imagery. If you've got your different kind of cognitive and motivational factors that may come back into what imagery is like during the observation of team-based movements, maybe. We're not sure.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting area, a challenging one, but I think interesting, both on the team level. And I think, I've had people call, almost you can't avoid it in a team setting. Like, people are going to observe other people, no matter whether you want to or not. You can't control it as well. So I think that's an important point. So maybe to end off, guys, I thought we'd give you a chance to ask you a little bit about Rio. And maybe Dave, I'll start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about it, and if people are interested in getting involved, or you can, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to promote it to everyone. So Rio stands for the Research in Imagery and Observation Group, and it's I guess it's a multidisciplinary academic interest group for people who are interested in research in imagery and observation, as the name describes, and that's very broad in terms of definition. So we'll have people who are looking at imagery and observation in clinical settings with Parkinson's or DCD or stroke, as well as people who are using it in sporting settings, people who are looking at the kind of cognitive or neurophysiological effects, as well as behavioral effects. And the group was formed in 2006. So we're about 15 years or so in, are we, I guess, now? and it's grown in size over the last few years. It used to be kind of a one-day conference. We had an annual conference one day a year, and it's now grown into a two-day event, usually managing to attract members and speakers from all over the world. And the kind of ethos behind Rio is that it's a supportive community for people who are interested in this kind of research. So it's definitely not a forum for people to be shouting everyone down. We're there to collaborate. We're all interested in the same thing. And a key emphasis of it is that it's very much, it doesn't matter what level you are. You could be, the most senior professor, or you could be an undergrad who's just starting their first dissertation project. You'd be welcome at Rio. Would encourage people to present and ask questions. And often it's a nice platform for people to get their first experience of presenting at a conference in a kind of supportive environment, which is really quite nice. So that's how all three of us sort of started out there as PhD students, and then now, as we've progressed in our careers, we've ended up organising the event. We're also running this year, because of the pandemic, we're not doing a full conference. We're doing a seminar series. I'll let one of the others step in and talk about that, so I don't hog all the limelight.
Adam, do you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, so we're running a seminar series every Friday, 2 till kind of roughly 4:30 UK time. So I know that's slightly early for you, Rob, but maybe a nice if you did fancy it. But we're getting kind of up to 3 or 4 talks per seminar, shortish talks, kind of 15 minutes, unless it's an invited talk, and then 10 minutes for questions. And we had our first seminar last Friday with a few nice kind of shorter talks, and then an invited talk as well. And actually the questions were, for me, that's where the thought-provoking stuff happens. So it was nice to kind of engage in that discussion, and gives you, like you said, more questions and answers, but things that you want to go and explore. So we had, I think, around kind of 60 people attending that online time. We're not recording them at the moment. We've kind of come up with a decision not to, just for we're taking it on kind of on top of everything else. And as you full well know, you've got a great setup, but needing to build that very quickly. So something that we're thinking about for the future, but we're going to see how it goes. And yeah, everyone's welcome. So if people want to join in, they can contact us, and we can provide kind of Zoom information and so on.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And Dan, anything else you wanted to add? And I also wanted to ask you, are there, we've talked about assessing people's imagery ability. Are there kind of like questionnaires and tools out there for people that want to dive into that they can get access to?
So for example, the VMIQ, I think it's the second version, VMIQ, and then there's the MIQ3. Probably direct people through a good place to start is Jen Cummings' website, and she's got loads of good resources on there. I guess those would be the first two, I would think. And just some kind of closing comments. I think, Rob, in your initial email invite, you'd kind of mentioned this is about observational learning, and I feel like we always had a plan to hijack this a little bit. And this actually, Jen said this at our last meeting, that over the years, the two research areas of observation and imagery kind of come together and go apart. And I think where we're at the minute is that there's real overlap. And as Dave said, it's much more about, well, why would you not do imagery? If you're thinking about doing a demonstration, our first kind of take message is imagery alongside that. That probably a performer spontaneously going to image whilst they observe. And so if that's happening, it's probably better to think about how you want to control that and make the best of that spontaneous imagery to give them the best start for that demonstration, regardless of what you're presenting. So that is what would kind of appeal to people to why to come to Rio, really, and talk about that more.
Yeah, no, I agree, Dan, and I kind of, I did kind of focus on the observation side of things, and I think you're right. It kind of goes. I think there's kind of a bias almost in practice, with coaches. Like demonstration is like a rigorous thing, whereas imagery is kind of this, sports psych thing that we want to stay away from. Sometimes they're uncontrolled. But yeah, I think a couple points are right. They're gonna do it whether you like it or not. And I really love the idea of the variability, the introducing that, and the two enhancing each other. I think that's a wonderful idea. So I think you're right. It is good for people to think about both of the things. Yeah, I really like that. So I think thank you everyone for joining us. There was quite a few people following along. No one wanted to step up and ask anything. That happens. But I hope everyone enjoyed it. And thank you for three. That was really fun discussion.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.